Welcome to Playthink, conversations about games, interactivity, art, and culture. This podcast is recorded live at the USC Game Innovation Lab, which is part of the USC Games program at the University of Southern California. For more information, follow us on Instagram at USC Game Innovation Lab or visit our website at gameinnovationlab.com/playthink.
All right, hello everyone here in the live person in studio audience, and a big hello to our listeners tuning in online. Welcome to Playthink Salon, where we dive deep into the worlds of games, art, culture, and interactivity. My name is Eric Park. I have the honor of guest hosting this episode today. I'm a first-year graduate student in the USC Interactive Media and Game Design program. So our guest today is Sam Roberts, a game designer, game curator, and games educator, whose work in collaborative design and game curation has helped shape independent game communities worldwide. Many of you know him as the co-founder and content director of Indiecade. Also, he's currently teaching at the UC Irvine Department of Informatics with their game design program, where he explores tabletop role-playing, game industry practices, and interactive media development. Today, we'll be mainly discussing his essay, Class Systems, featured in the book Well Played for the Love of Games. In this piece, Sam examines Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that many of us admire for its deep strategic gameplay, intricate narrative, and impactful class system design. We'll be unpacking his analysis, the role of system design in storytelling, and how class structures in games mirror and challenge real-world hierarchies. So, Sam, welcome to the Game Innovation Lab's Playthink Salon.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Eric, for that very thorough introduction.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited to have that conversation you just talked about.
So, to kick things off, let's start from the big picture. So the book, Well Played for the Love of Games, I did get a chance to peek at your essay and also a few other essays in there. They're all, it's a very special collection of very personal stories about games. So can you tell us a little bit more about the book as a whole and how your essay ended up in there?
Yeah, well, the person you should be talking to is Drew Davidson, who's the editor who assembled the piece, and Well Played as a series is Drew's baby,
Right.
And always has been. So I wrote an essay for Drew about an experience I actually had with my dear friend Tracy Fullerton for the second Well Played collection, Well Played 2. So I know that when Drew was working on this new Well Played collection, he wanted to ask people who'd been contributors in the past, he wanted to ask people who'd been a part of the Well Played family to sort of dive in deeper on this notion of what it is to love games in this Well Played sense. Each journal of Well Played really has had themes, that are asking us to explore what does Well Played not just mean in general, but in this, and they're always quite open. One of the things I love about the Well Played journal, I'm one of the editors for the journal, so I look at pieces that end up in the collections, is that it's just a wildly diverse set of writings. Some of them are what you would consider almost traditional academic papers, statistical analysis and abstracts. Some of them are personal essays, and they run the gamut in between. And games are so powerful because they are so many things, and because they are a design craft, there's all these interesting lenses to look at them from. And again, Well Played is just really cool in that way. And Drew manages to get a really diverse set of eyes to consider what it means to be well played, to consider what these things are. So Drew had asked me, he was like, do you want to contribute to this one? And I had been thinking for a long time about what my, not big idea, but what is my design thesis? It's something I had to think about more deeply as I made the transition even to UCI and stuff like that. And so I thought that these games that I loved, that I had wanted to write about, that I had already written about, would make a good window into that, and that I had to sort of be doing some of that work anyway. So I told Drew I would get him something.
So the essay is mainly concerns Final Fantasy Tactics, but
Yeah.
it does start with your personal anecdote about Commedia dell'arte,
Yeah.
and also the old Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I
So,
cover, technically, before I get into the meat of the thing,
right.
I cover Pool of Radiance, the initial the initial gold box game developed by Strategic Simulations Incorporated, that was an adaptation of the official Dungeons and Dragons rules. I then also talk about Dungeons and Dragons and Final Fantasy, connecting them to the themes that are introduced to me by Pool of Radiance, and then bringing all of that to talk about Final Fantasy Tactics itself, which actually, Pool of Radiance is the first computer game to have this tactical battle map approach to RPG battles, right? So that same core framework is still present in Final Fantasy Tactics, right? And then this other thread of Final Fantasy and these ideas of Dungeons and Dragons are coming out in there. So. And then yes, I do connect it all to Commedia dell'arte, which is my like very personal anecdote. I talk about it all the time. I think it's a fascinating art form with a lot of lessons.
So, just going a little deeper into why, in particular, you chose Final Fantasy Tactics of all the possible other games that you could have chosen.
I think that that's a great question, and I think that there are probably games that do more with some ideas to capture narrative ideas within their simulatory systems. I don't know that Final Fantasy Tactics is actually perfect at that. However, I love it very deeply. And therefore, in the framework of this book and thinking about my personal design theses, it makes a lot of sense for me to present Final Fantasy Tactics. It's also specific to the thing I am driving at here, which is the thing that it does do well, though on its face, not connected to the evocative nature of the story or perhaps the overall delivered experience narrative, is deeply evocative of the experience of play and what I think actually Matsuno is trying to achieve with the game. So, yeah.
Right on. Delving deeper into Final Fantasy Tactics. So one of the most iconic features in the game is the job system, where you can essentially mix and match to kind of create your own sort of character. So, but at the same time, it blends really well with the narrative and the story and the messaging of the game about power, hierarchy, social mobility. Um, so you mentioned in the essay how the class system isn't just about strategy, but also reinforces the story's conflicts. Characters are bound by their roles, much like the social structures they live in. So, how do you see the intersection of class systems in games and the narratives they create?
Well, there are two interesting answers to this question. So you hinted at, but didn't dive deep on. There's a genuine resonance that has to be dealt with around the fact that, like, we use the word class, and that classes are often reflective of actual class, and that there are complications both that provide opportunities for evocative speech and risks in offending people, or saying things that maybe you don't mean when you talk about class in that way. And I think there's actually rich potential for that. I do think Final Fantasy Tactics has some dodges at that. And if you look at the way that the people that you face in the game are coded as classes in different encounters, lower class encounters use jobs that are lower on the job tree. Or are in specific single paths. And when you attack castles, when you deal with wealthy people, you fight with the higher tier classes. Part of this aligns with the fact that you are encountering lower level soldiers and stuff earlier, and you are fighting the nobility themselves later. But this, it's not necessarily a happy accident. right? So there is this sense that like through achievement is how you climb, and then there's narrative points in the game that are echoing this idea, right? Your best friend is a commoner, but they achieve and climb up the class line, and you see them do this, right? And they do it through their actions. So I think that stuff is present, and at least the fact that the model extends, to me, suggests that there's some thinking about that there, right? More broadly, and with Final Fantasy Tactics, I think that what is interesting about systems is that, to me, as a game designer, a lot of game design is figuring out what the exciting parts are of the experience I want to have, the things that I am interested in and I want players to be interested in. And then for me, and it isn't this for everyone necessarily, I systematize those. Because I think that systems are compelling and sticky and provide feedback well. And that's what I want the most exciting parts of my game to be, is compelling and sticky and give feedback well, right? That said, where you choose to systematize is where you want players spending their time thinking, okay? And so I am excited by class systems because they very explicitly say, if you take even just half a step back, think about who you are. And then if the game's feedback mechanisms and like core narratives and set pieces and objects you've built to interact with are reactive in interesting ways based off that definition of who you are, this becomes quite evocative, right? Not every game fits into this structure. Fine. You could do this pretty badly, I think, also fine. But I think that there's a very interesting design space in this idea of saying, tell me what has shaped the perspective you want, or what is the framework you're taking here, and then I will feed back to that framework specifically, and in that way we can generate really interesting emergent speech about what it means to be a lower class nobility climbing to the upper classes, or trapped as a rich class in a world where everyone who gets to the top then dies, or any of these other sort of larger narrative beats, which then we can tell cool stories about.
So you answered this a little bit in your previous answer, but do you think there are any shortcomings or areas where Tactics could have pushed the idea of using mechanics to reinforce storytelling a little further?
Yes and no. Yeah, I think that, right, one of the things that you could move further with is more emergent narrative possibility within the encounters themselves that's driven by choices you make in this definitional of who you are system, right? Fire Emblem does this really well because as you build relationships between those characters, those relationships create narrative moments and tactical moments that create new emergent narratives on the battlefield. So there's none of that, right? There are some characters that if you follow their subquests, you get other characters they're related to, but then they don't actually typically have any feedback between those characters' abilities that says these people are meant to go together, right? This is something that you can do in a system like this. And then again, you are asking questions about what does it mean to go together tactically? Can we reinforce that narratively? Is it interesting? Are we saying something fun like these characters whose powers match hate each other because they are like fire and ice, right? There's all this opportunity for like fun emergent narrative suggestion through how you then put, to speak in Game Design Workshop terms, like dramatic elements on the formal elements of this system, right? And so I think Final Fantasy Tactics is just that there's a rich space that it doesn't get to there. I think its class system is extremely mechanically oriented and low on evocative dramatic elements that interface with the story that is being told. The evocative character elements are reserved for non-player characters who can have special in-world classes like Holy Knight and things like this, right? Whereas you are sort of left with the more standard Final Fantasy tactics. This is because it fits in the genre.
Right.
You make concessions. And there's some things that are really fun about that. It gave the game a much broader audience, I think, in a lot of ways, and lets it feed back on the larger Final Fantasy canon, which is other stuff that you can do.
Right.
But so yeah, I think there's basically, I would say, some missed opportunities and some, there are problems with doing this at all, right? And like, there are plenty of games where you have little to no role play, where you are not asked to take on much of a role beyond operating the systems of the game. Right? And they are wonderful games that are great. This is not a required design element, and adding it, like most design elements, brings constraints and complications and risks. But when you do it, you can do it thoughtfully. And I see so many class systems rolling out into other types of games as RPG elements like filter across the video gamosphere, right? We have class-based shooters, right? I know somebody who was working on a class-based puzzler, right? Like, there's opportunities here for this kind of stuff, and so I think it's important to think, like, what is it, how can we also be leveraging this design tool to be a narrative design tool? I'm very opposed broadly to this, it's not a consensus, to this idea that like the systemic and the narrative are in opposition, or even separate buckets of design that can be disentangled. You have to talk about them separately sometimes, right? But like, they have, the experience of the game is an emergent experience that comes from the player interfacing with all of these elements and operating them by the rules, right? So at the end of the day, it will all contribute to that final thing. And so anytime you say, well, that's not the thing, so I don't care, you're missing an opportunity. Now, we have to not care because we have to ship the game.
Right.
But we can be thoughtful and make choices about where we do and do not care, so that we are picking the best things to reinforce the experience or story or narrative that we are trying to tell.
So you got into it a little bit by the end, talking about blending essentially a class system into a narrative experience and back and forth. Are you aware of any examples that you feel like have successfully like evolved or pushed forward this concept of class-based design, and more specifically how it blends back and forth between mechanics and narrative?
So I think most interesting innovations in class-based design happen in more traditional RPG spaces.
Right.
I think there are genres that are almost entirely this. The sort of like princess maker, raise your kid genre is this like choosing who this person becomes over time, written in extreme minute detail, right? I think it misses the narrative opportunities because they're all essentially isekai, right? By which I mean that you then become a central character in raising this person and then have weird sort of like genre cultural fantasies around what that is. It is written in that fashion, is how I should say that. As far as like, I also take a bit of a wide lens on this. So anywhere where you get to define who you are is taking steps in this direction. Right? So, for instance, I am a big fan of Keep Driving. Keep Driving won an award, I think the Grand Jury Prize at Indiecade this year. It is a role-playing game where you are a teenager going on a road trip to a music festival across the country. And like Oregon Trail, you start by equipping your vehicle with the things that you are going to take. And then over time, you get people and things who add affordances to your capacity as a vehicle that shape the encounters that are randomly produced by its system and create an emergent narrative that is directly framed by these things that you've chosen to take with you, right? There is a very famous book about Vietnam called The Things They Carried. which is a wonderful text that tells this story of this group of soldiers in Vietnam based on the objects they have and the narratives that are connected with them, right? This is, to me, like what Keep's trying to do is that same kind of storytelling, right? The objects, because there are few enough of them and because of the way they're designed, they have narrative weight and meaning to them that then in the ways that they react with that world, really cool, interesting stuff happens. And the player has a deeply active choice in shaping their journey by saying, I'm going to bring this and I'm not going to bring this, right? I understand that sometimes when I talk about this, because of the way I love to talk about things, there's bleed, right? You could say after what I just said that, well, you could define any game that way, right? The choices you make are who you are. I think that there is some barrier here, right? Like the choices I make in a game of chess are not defining my narrative positionality to the game of chess. They do shape the narrative, right? And I might get an emergent narrative positionality like I am a student, I am a master, I am the fool. That's how I am when I play chess. I always end up as the fool. But, you know, because that game is often asking you explicitly, is this a person or a thing that you need on this trip? That's a part of your trip, that you're bringing on this trip, right? And so you're defining who you are at that point. This is who I am in terms of this game, right? And so more stuff like that, where the choices themselves in some way feel diegetic to the universe, right? And there's thoughtfulness about what they mean in terms of the things you might interact with that interacts with the, again, the story you want to tell or the experience you want to deliver. And I would like to see more of that. I think a lot of games are doing it well if you take half a step back, but the best example I can think of is that Keep Driving.
Ooh, I should definitely check that out.
Game's great.
For sure.
It's great.
Yeah. I think that mention about the book about Vietnam would be a great segue into the topic about, you've touched on it, the bleed, the real world parallels with tactics, with systems, with narratives. So as a designer and an educator, right, how do you think games should approach social systems and inequalities in design?
That's a big question. Right, so the first thing is, as I'm always ranting about everywhere I go, right, systems are metaphors. They are always a representation of another thing, right? So at the base level, you are saying that, I'm going to call it this, right? And when you do that, you leave stuff out and you keep stuff in. You make choices about what those things are. The best way that I know how to be respectful of the real world inequalities and broken systems that exist is to be mindful when you make your metaphor, right? And that means not like, oh, I really like this system, and so I'm going to dress it up as this thing, right? Because there's going to be a lot of emergent speech you are creating or when you do that, right? Like, so that is dangerous, right? But even when you try, and because of how design is, you know, you'll test out system ideas against it. You'll play test them. You'll think your way through them. You'll have real tests. Once you've settled on something, you still need to be reflective, even if you've developed it on your own to express it, that you are aware of your own biases and prejudices and how those are baked into the systems. The example I always give in my classes is SimCity, which is how Will Wright thinks a city should operate, not how a city should operate, and which is fine, right? But everyone should be aware of that, including Will Wright. So, you know, you have to have reflective practice. I mean, look, everyone here is a student or a participant in USC Games, the Game Innovation Lab. You've taken 541, right? Reflective practice is at the basis of what is taught here, and it is the key to doing a lot of these important things. Now, I think class systems as a design tool offer really interesting opportunities to build commentary on real world inequalities and real world class systems. And I have not seen a deeply interesting take on it. There are lots of takes that rub up against it, that incorporate it, right? There's plenty of people who have systematized economic inequality as a part of their game, mostly blindly because they seemed interesting and they applied a mechanic to it, right? And therefore there's all this redolent information that comes from it. This happens a lot in tabletop role-playing games, which often throw up, or whatever, often simulate a world, right? And so people feel like a simulation is not a metaphoric system, but rather is a simulation. This is just how it is, right? But it's not just how it is. It's how it is in this specific world. It's always a metaphor. You've chosen how the simulation works and what you simulate there. And you could do really interesting things, simulating on a more deep level what economic class is, rather than like roll randomly on this table, and if you get lucky, you get extra stuff. What are the differences? Again, you can really get in a deep territory here. This is a broader problem with class systems. The closer you come to talking about real world issues, the more risk you run of presenting bias or prejudice or stereotypes. Because when we systematize real people, we group them, and this is a married action to stereotyping. You have to be really careful with all of that, and it's hard to do it thoughtfully and well, and when you do, you will still make mistakes, and some people will be offended. Maybe not. Maybe you can do it perfectly. Very few things are done perfectly. That doesn't, Eric's point is correct. You should try to make them as perfect as possible. But you should accept that they may not be perfect in the end.
So that was some amazing advice about system design, class design, all of that. I think the number 0 in that list of advice would probably be being mindful and being as reflective as possible in your design practice. So if you were to give some advice to the fledgling class system designers out there, what are some other pieces of nuggets of wisdom you could offer us?
So I've hinted at some of these things, but
Right.
I think that generally, when you look at your class system, it should be reflecting approaches to your game. That this is the richest space in which to generate differentiated feedback and make the space feel reactive to the class system, which is key to achieving this idea where you really get emergent sort of language and experience. So what that means is saying, right, we can talk about this in strict design terms in more classic games, but like in Dungeons and Dragons, it says you need someone who can explore and open space that is difficult to explore. You need someone who can heal the party and buff them and keep them safe. You need someone who can unleash very powerful magics when you're faced with the darkest, scariest foes. And you need someone whose job it is kind of to do everything else and be tough and angry looking, right? And these are the classes of Dungeons and Dragons, right? And they want a play experience specifically, by the way, where you do those different things and you are reliant on each other to be supported in doing them. The design goals around that have shifted and changed, but still fundamentally underlie the game in its most recent edition, right? That is actually extremely good class design. Here's how I want people to play the game. I'm going to give them like costumes that they can wear that give them extra stuff when they choose to play the game that way, that helps them with dramatic storytelling and other stuff like that. And then I'm going to build the mechanics so that they are forced to play together in the way I want them to play. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Harder to do maybe in video game, but class-based shooters do this. They build challenges that require you to have these different team members, okay? Because again, they want you to collaborate. But that's not necessarily the only way to do this. It doesn't have to map to multiplayer games where you're forcing collaboration through splitting up the different skills, right? You can think about games that want to offer alternate paths to victory, right? And then you could build a class, not that closes all the other ones off to you, but that is best suited to a specific path, that has advantages in pursuing it. There's all of a sudden this huge, rich emergent space, both out of finding the path that I'm suited to, but also once you've mastered the game, creating a whole new layer of potential mastery where you're like, well, I took the wizard class, but I beat it on thief path, right? That's cool, okay? And again, wizards and thieves are not particularly narratively evocative, but you could make choices that are. And I'm hesitant to make those choices, to show you an example of that, because I actually think what's interesting is taking this thinking and putting it in places that it feels like it doesn't belong at first, right? I like the idea that there are games that have a whole bunch of interactions in them that aren't what we think of as game-like interactions right now. And how could we divide those up among different types of people and make systems that represent how they do that, and then build a game that asks its players to do some fundamentally different interactions, or if not fundamentally different, narratively coded in a very different way. That's reinforced by the systems, right? That's not just narratively coded by changing the name on the game object. Yeah, is that decent advice?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Okay. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. And that was the end of my questions and end of the talk. So thank you so much for being here today. And really quickly, where can people find you?
I have a website, I guess. That's www.samashtonroberts.com. So that's the easiest way to find me. I don't post a lot of content. That is not, well, okay, I don't post a lot of content. I do have a blog on Substack with my friend and collaborator, Luke Crane. We write about designing role-playing games. So that's called Ludological Alchemy. Yeah, those are probably the places to look for me.
Awesome. Now we're gonna open the floor up to questions from the live studio audience. Seems like Brian has a question.
Yeah, well, let's give him the mic, since we can get over Brian's question on mic.
Hi Sam, thanks for coming down. It was a
Yeah.
fantastic conversation. There's a comment and a question. Comment way earlier in the conversation, you said that Final Fantasy games back in the day, you start off fighting soldiers and work your way up to fighting kings. It's kind of funny that the king is more equipped for combat than a regular soldier. I just thought that was funny. My question is that I'm curious to know whether you feel like mainline Final Fantasy games have moved away from these class systems. Like Cloud starts off as a mercenary, but he can kind of end up doing everything. And same for like Final Fantasy games today. I am curious to know whether you feel like it's because the shift is due to players' tastes in general, or is it our relationship with our own class systems in our society?
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question. The first thing I will say is that I think that different ways of breaking up what a player's abilities are still fundamentally class systems, and putting choice in the play of that is an interesting thing, and Final Fantasy games still do that now. However, I do think more modern Final Fantasy games have a more mishmash of player roles.
A hybrid class, or?
Yeah, I think part of this is that there is a real strong feeling among the audience who wants to fall in love with certain characters, but then play in the way that they want to play, that they want to be able to build any character as any type of thing. But I haven't even played a lot of recent mainline Final Fantasies, so I couldn't say that that's true. But like, if you look at Final Fantasy X, it doesn't work that way at all. Even though it's an open development sphere grid, it is functionally a class system because of where you start and the abilities you have access to get. Yeah. So yeah, I think there is a genre space desire, and like fan culture around it that really wants you to be able to take any character any direction, that has become reinforced, and that is what you may be perceiving as sort of less specification or existence of a class system. And I would say that the bad side of what that is that because it's a mishmash, it is less evocative. You are not forced to confront the game in a way that is bound by the choices you've made, even if you can update them a little bit as you go. And I think there's a lot of really interesting, again, rich gameplay opportunity there. But Final Fantasy also continues to push its narratives in non-gameplay oriented. Like a lot of its big complex narratives come in cutscenes and cutscene style activity that happens around the game. In which case, having a narrative character who is unshifting and a blank canvas for powers so that players can play in the style that they choose is, again, it's a good choice, but it loses the opportunity, right, for it loses the opportunity for more designed feedback between those, right? The feedback could still be meaningful, right, but it is harder to design for the case of this and this can go together in any sort of combination and still be resonant. And then you just wanted to know how that implicates our real class systems. I mean, this is like deep philosophy, I don't even know, but American Western expansionist taste has driven taste space for the last 50 plus years at least. I think that is changing, which is probably a good thing. And the expansionist ideal and the American ideal is the rags to riches story, is that anyone can become anything, okay? And this is actually captured as a, part of the gestalt that made Dungeons and Dragons and the original idea of the class system so wonderful, this idea of advancement in games. I play the game and I get stuff and it makes me go from rags to riches, right? Like leveling in D&D is rags to riches systematized. So I think that there is this, because we have this idea that I want to be able to become anything, there is a tension around that with this idea of making class systems which are fixed. This is actually what I think is really interesting evocatively about Final Fantasy Tactics, is also the narrative is purely fixed. All of the emergent beats come from the way you approach these encounters. There's not a branch on the narrative tree. Nary a one. Except that you can choose to do some side quests or not. So this idea of like, that's just a rich space. And I don't know that we're using it to talk, but right, I think that there is a sense right now in America that anyone can be anything, except really if you are a billionaire, you can do whatever you want and otherwise go get fucked. Oh, I'm sorry. So, I mean, like, that's a rich metaphoric space that you could explore with this stuff. And I don't see people doing it. And I actually generally see the broader genre trends moving away from it. Moving away from additional, like, coding around class. The people who are doing it in a very fun way are League, where each hero is essentially a class. And they are heavily coded. And they can pop them out as one-offs, which lets them comment on things, make new little ideas, experiment with what it's like to be engaged in League from this framework or this idea. And I think that's a really rich space. And I think that a huge chunk of the content design in that studio is teams of designers and artists and producers, whole groups of people who design a single champion, a single character class for League of Legends over a long period of time, right? So yeah, there's lots of rich space and good stuff happening in this. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did I answer your question, Brian?
Very well. Yeah.
Okay.
Should I introduce myself? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Okay, so hi, my name is Daniel. This is a bit of a two-part question. So first, what are your favorite RPG games? And second, are there any games with interesting or unique systems that you recommend designers play?
I mean, my favorite video game RPGs, a bunch to talk about in the essay. I love Pool of Radiance. I think it's still fantastic. I love Final Fantasy Tactics. I do love the original Final Fantasy. I love Dragon Quest III. Lena's heard all of these things. I think, I think like the Persona series is a really interesting examination of these kinds of class systems. They have these layered class systems where you both sort of choose and shape your demons that you summon, but also your core character. And that core character shaping is actually a big chunk of the rest of the game. Like you're playing like a high school sim, and then you're doing that. So I think there's interesting stuff happening in that space. But then like my favorite RPGs, a lot are tabletop RPGs that I play. And I think there's a million interesting examples of how people ask you to define a character or think your way through what your class is in games like that. From the very, very simple, like in a game like Fiasco, where you sort of like have like a one-sentence description line about who you are, and then you play that framework really hard, to something a lot more intricate and insane, where you're sort of like slowly building up your character by making an increasingly minute subset of choices and collecting abilities, like Dungeons and Dragons, for instance. Like I said, Keep Driving I think is fantastic, and to me that's a class system and it's super interesting. I love playing sort of fresh new RPGs like this. Yeah, I guess that's sort of my question for what my favorites are. It is a deep cut, but there was a computer role-playing game in the 90s called Darklands, which was set in like medieval Germany, and you fought Knights Templar and witches and demons. And the character creation for that was you would have a person of a social class, and then they would have different jobs available to them, and you would sort of like take them through this path of their career, building up skills and assets until you decided the character had retired from their career to become an adventurer. Burning Wheel, which is designed by Luke Crane, has a really interesting character generation system that is similar to this, where you come from a stock and then you randomly roll or choose from these nested tables to sort of figure out the narrative of who you are up to this point. And I really love stuff like that. I think it's interesting. I think for a tabletop role-playing game where you are asked to create a personage, not really handed one, it's very helpful to give this process that essentially, again in like Games Not Workshop terms, gives you dramatic elements to add to that narrative in addition to the mechanical elements, right? That again have narrative feedback but aren't necessarily the same thing. The dramatic element is not just that you've named your power beam eye lasers or whatever, right? It's part of another subtler set of choices that says like, I was mutated in a nuclear factory or whatever, that give you story stuff that you can then deploy and use and play. And I like that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
No? No? Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Sam.
Hey, Tracy.
So, you and I obviously share a love of Pool of Radiance,
Yes.
and we've talked about that a lot over the years. I've never really, dug as deeply as you have into this notion of class. I've never really that isn't why it attracted me, right? And as I'm listening to you talk about this, systemizing of class, I actually think that it's the wrong word. I think it's caste almost. And I'm sitting here and wondering about this fascination with categorization of peoples, right? Why are we so fascinated with categorizing our skills and proclivities? Why can I not be a citizen scientist and warrior, right? Why do I have to be
One or the other.
one or the other, right? Isn't that part of what our oppressors do to keep us from having a kind of, living the best lives that we possibly can?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering why in systems of play we are so fascinated with putting ourselves into these very strict and rigid categories. Can you maybe talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I can actually. So I think it's because of what play is. Play is about exploring and learning at a high level to me, right? So we play to learn things, to as if the world, and figure things out before we have to do them in reality, right? And to do that, play needs constraints. You can be playful with no constraints in an open, playful space, but as soon as you start to make that a play experience that has lessons where you can experience things, you are self-adding constraints that create that. So it's a constraint. It's a really beautiful, simple, easy to understand constraint because our oppressors are constantly using it in our real lives, right? But it also, we shape the whole world around us by how we name it, how we perceive it, how we intake it, right? And so like the idea that other people have another role lets us then try to understand them by giving some name and shape to what those roles are. And yes, like I said, it runs all these risks because it is categorizing and it is systematizing and casting, right? And that plays to type and makes a bunch of statements that may or may not be true and constrains the idea that we could be anything or do anything or are anything, right? But again, like constraints make rich play experiences. So I just think it's an interesting approach to constraint.
Yes, I tend to agree with you. I was just trying to, in a way,
Elicit that response.
exactly, because it is so fascinating that great play is made up of often taking something that is not good
Yeah.
in our real lives and finding a way to make it good, make it playful.
Make it fun. Fun is a strong word, but make it playful is the
Yeah,
word.
right? And so it is not good that we are categorized, that I am slotted as a creative and someone else is slotted as a STEM kid, right?
Right.
It is not good. And yet, by playing with it, we may figure out ways in our real lives to overcome those boundaries, those classes.
Yeah, to see how, as a STEM kid and as a creative, we can be the same kid.
Yeah, we can be the same kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at
Lovely.
least how, the STEM kids' experiences are the same. as well.
Lovely. Yes, I was getting feedback, but it's gone now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, to everyone tuning in, thank you so much for joining us for this Playthink Salon discussion. Today we talked about how systems and class mechanics can shape storytelling and create meaning. So, thank you so much. Stay curious, keep designing, and we'll see you next time at Playthink Salon.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Eric. You did a lovely job.